Henry and Angeline Barker's oldest child, John C. Barker, was born in 1858. His middle name is uncertain, but he was most likely named after his uncle John Calhoun Barker, who fought with Henry in the Civil War. That same year, Minnesota became the 32nd state, and Abraham Lincoln was nominated for senator from Illinois. John grew up on their farm at Grassy Creek. Not much is known about his early life, but by age 27 in 1885, in the earliest archived year for the Hazel Green Herald, John was described as a minister from Stillwater Bridge in nearby Wolfe County, about 15 miles southwest of his boyhood home, although there is evidence that he was still living at home and merely making visits there to preach. The following year, he was ordained as minister in the church he grew up in and in which his father still preached, the Grassy Lick Regular Baptist Church. On one of his visits to Stillwater, John met Arzelia Rose, living with her family, most likely when they attended one of his sermons there. By January 1889, they were corresponding by mail that were clearly letters of courtship. They were married on November 14th of that year, the same day journalist Nellie Bly set out on her Jules Verne-inspired journey around the world in 80 days. She did it in 72. Within 10 months, Arzelia gave birth to their first child, Powell Elmer, followed by William Harold, Luna Dell, and Silas Garland. Two of Arzelia's sisters, who were heading to the newly discovered oil fields of Oklahoma in the Indian Territories with their husbands and children, sold their rich bottomland at Stillwater to John Barker to add to the land Arzelia bought from her cousin John D. Rose at age 17. That included some overlooking hills and a cave-like depression where valuables were hidden during the Civil War. By 1907, Arzelia had given birth to 3 more children. A daughter, Mabel, lived only 13 months, dying of a short illness in 1903. Rodney Ray, and their last child, Janola Lee. Sometime after the turn of the century, John and Arzelia donated land on high ground above the Stillwater Bridge for a combination church and school to be built where John would teach school during the week and preach the gospel on the weekends. He called his students in flock with this handbell. John and Arzelia's own children had attended school a half-mile west at Trace Fork before his was built at Stillwater, but it went only through the 8th grade. The Barkers greatly valued education, at least for their sons, and sent them to the Hazel Green Academy through the 12th grade. Elmer, Harold, and Rodney all attended the academy, which was also a boarding school. The boys, beginning at about age 13, would ride the 10 miles to school on horseback and board there during the week, returning home for the weekends. John was not the only son to follow in their father Henry's footsteps of becoming a public school teacher. George W. Barker became a licensed teacher. James Dudley would teach until his death from tuberculosis in 1910. William Benjamin would even become superintendent of Morgan County schools. John was not a big man, and most in the area referred to him as Reverend Johnny Barker. He was well known and apparently well liked throughout Wolfe County and parts of Morgan County. He was a guest minister at many regular Baptist churches in the area. Like his father, John was often called out to comfort a sick or dying church member in the dead of night, often in the dead of winter. On at least one occasion, he took a shortcut to a dying church member's home on a foggy night and got lost. His horse even stopped, refusing to budge another step. John waited there until daybreak, and when the fog lifted, he was shocked to find they were standing only 10 feet from a sheer cliff. By all accounts, John was a gentle man, although his sermons could be fiery. He was more laid back than the straight-laced Arzelia. One account, told to this video's author by an aunt who was in attendance, described a scene in church where John was wrapping up his sermon when a mouse ran up Arzelia's dress. As it made its way toward her neckline, she calmly pinned it against her chest until John had finished the benediction, so as not to interfere with the sanctity of the moment. The mouse did not survive the religious experience. John and Arzelia raised corn in the bottomland, also sorghum as animal fodder, and it was sometimes boiled to make sorghum molasses. In addition, they raised tobacco as a cash crop. They had a few cows, hogs, and some horses for riding and plowing, a typical small farm of the time. When Rodney wasn't planting corn, plucking chickens, rendering hogs for lard and soap, drying tobacco, working a team of horses, or boiling sorghum, he would steal away to go fishing in Stillwater Creek below the bridge. As the children grew up, they all eventually left home. Elmer was the only one to remain in Kentucky after a stint in the Army, living out his life on a farm at Winchester with his wife Mary Wynn Hampton. Harold, a doughboy who served in France at the end of World War I, went to work in the oil fields farther north and raised his family in Colon, Michigan with his wife, Averill Horton. Lunadell lived in Wolfe County for several years with her husband, Marion L. Horton, before he got a job in a steel mill in Middletown, Ohio, where they lived out their lives. Garland joined the Army and remained a bachelor until late in his life when he married Ruth Reed in 1955 while living in Dearborn, Michigan. Youngest son, Rodney Ray, used his woodworking skills he had learned at Berea College to land a job in the Ford Aviation Division in Detroit. During his brief time there, he worked on a special edition Ford Trimotor for famous aviator Charles Lindbergh. He eventually landed in Middletown, Ohio, working in the steel mill as well, and later in their advertising and art department. He met 20-year-old Jean Cable on a return trip to Stillwater, and they eloped, getting married in Lexington before returning to Middletown. By the late 1920s, only Genola and Garland remained at home at Stillwater with John and Arzelia and John's mother, Angeline Jevin, who was dying of mouth cancer. She succumbed in 1928. John suffered a stroke in the summer of 1934 and another just before Christmas, and died of pneumonia in July 1935. After his death, the house and land was deeded to Genola by her mother and her sibling heirs in consideration of her taking care of Arzelia until her death. Genola had recently married Wilmer Hieronymus, who made visits from Detroit, where he worked in the auto industry. Arzelia, who had suffered from a condition called bronchiectasis for many years, was not in good health either. Bronchiectasis is a destruction and widening of the large airways and can be congenital or acquired. She suffered most of the typical symptoms: cough, paleness, shortness of breath, fatigue, weight loss, and sunken chest. Vulnerable to respiratory infections, she caught the flu just before Christmas 1937 and died a month later. She and John are buried together in the Hazel Green Cemetery. The house, depicted here in a drawing by Elmer's daughter, Ann Wynne Kincaid, and the farm was cared for by neighbor J.B. Tutt until Genola decided to auction the farm in 1944. Unfortunately, a 1939 flood had washed out the Stillwater Bridge, cutting off access to the farm and the main road, greatly reducing its value. It brought only about $3,500 at auction. The house stood abandoned into the 1960s. Only traces of a foundation remain today, along with a view of the rich bottomland from the porch of the church and school that John built. If one listens carefully, one can hear the laughs and shouts of John's kids on their way to school or playing in Stillwater Creek, or over one's shoulder, John preaching the gospel or giving a history lesson to his students. Look for the next video that covers Arzelia's fascinating Rose side of the family.